What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea, a new world order.
I honestly don't know if I'm ready for this episode. Ooh, all right, let's get it done. Welcome back, you cool cats. It's Hard Talks Podcast. That clip was a speech given by H.W. Bush on September 11th, 1991, exactly 10 years before the 9/11 devastation, where he speaks of a new world order. I feel your ears perking up already. Buckle up, buttercups, because this episode is jam-packed with conspiracies and retold stories of our dark history. So, a bit of a trigger warning. Assault, drugs, murder, etc. This is the 8th episode in our conspiracy saga of the most wealthy and powerful families who rule the world. We're just going to be jumping in today's rabbit hole, so if you're lost, Alice, go back one episode. And remember, everyone listening or watching, hi. The views of the following conspiracies do not necessarily reflect the beliefs or opinions of Hard Talks production, i.e. me. And however you filter the following information is 100% completely up to you. Ain't that beautiful? More golf claps. Yay. Yay. Now that I have you all fuming and you all got a taste of what we're dealing with from the previous episode about Prescott Bush, or as I like to call him, P. Bushy, this is where I need to quickly slide this story in to get you even more heated. And because, oops, I forgot to mention it. And it's a pretty big deal. Actually, nay, it is a very big deal. Descendants of famous Apache leader and medicine man Geronimo, you might recognize the name, filed a lawsuit against the Skull and Bone Society at Yale University in 2010. They claim that the society's members, including Prescott Bush, dug up and stole Geronimo's remains from a burial plot at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1918 when he was a pledge and when he was a student. Legend has it that Prescott Sheldon Bush was involved in taking Geronimo's remains and bringing them back to the society in New Haven. This lawsuit was filed in federal court in Washington, D.C. The family named former President Barack Obama, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, and Secretary of the Army Pete Guerin as defendants because Geronimo's remains were supposed to be considered property of the federal government, right? Well, it's not the case. The lawsuit was dismissed by Judge Richard Roberts, who ruled that the lawsuit against Yale and their secret society should be dropped, citing that Geronimo's remains don't apply as government property. The law only applies to Native American cultural artifacts, items excavated or discovered after 1990, which is so stupid. Additionally, he ruled in Yale's favor on grounds that the Skull and Bones aren't technically on Yale's campus, and therefore they're their own entity. Whispers say that to this day, Geronimo's remains, amongst really other weird occult-like relics, are still in the society's clubhouse, if you will. So like his remains, there's stories of other people's remains, and weird shit like, I don't know, Adolf Hitler's silverware. Right? Like, let's put that in a glass case. Let's make sure we have that. Like, what? But that is how, ladies and gentlemen, we set a tone for a long-ass, twisty, and turny episode. So say hello to our next corrupt man in power, United States 41st President George Herbert Walker Bush, and we will call him Bushy Bush Sr. This guy's also got a freaking resume and conspiracies tied to him like a simp tied to a bedpost, guys. Yeah. Although he and his sons were deemed as, quote, intellectually light, George Herbert Walker Bush, aka Poppy Bush, made his impact anyway. Born June 1924, he also attended Yale, and he was also a bonesman of the highly secretive Skull and Bones Society. Then the guy went on to have a poor Navy career, if we're being honest and reading beyond the headlines. Everyone wants to paint him as a war hero, but he really wasn't. He only finished like 5 out of 6 years of his first and only term. And you'll find with the Bush family, there were no military heroes, no epic scholars or great visionaries throughout their family's history. Their reputation and wealth was solely built off the backs of blue-collar workers, war, and black gold. And it catapulted them into the spotlight as air quote, great, highly impressionable political candidates to control. Always keep this in mind because I personally don't believe that the Bushes were ever the masterminds behind anything. But you can form your own opinion. That being said, once H.W. got out of the Navy, he used his family connections to get into the oil industry as well, where he too went on to make more millions. Then Bush Sr. began his political career over many campaigns, but like his Navy career, the guy started out as a lousy politician. Bush Sr. didn't win a single campaign. That is, until he became Ronald Reagan's vice president. But more on that in a moment. Before H.W.'s vice presidency, Sr. managed to hold every non-elected position that the Republican Party could arrange for him. And I'm not kidding. Bushy Sr. used the family's elite connections to become a Congress representative of the oil-rich Texas district. That's where Texas comes into play with W. He was the chief of the Republican National Committee, head of the freaking CIA, and U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, which, conspiracy numero uno, the Central Intelligence Agency is spooky, to put it lightly, and absolutely could qualify as the definition of corrupt. Even presidents like JFK attempted to disband the government organization because it was never a secret how dirty their hands really were. You know what I'm saying? But look what happened to JFK. Conspiracy 2, the United Nations is a part of this conspiracy we've been talking about as a whole. The United Nations have been under scrutiny about their real purpose for a very long time, connected to a bunch of things that we've already discussed, like the BIS, the World Bank, part owned by every family that we've talked about, and then some. It's related to the Bilderberg Group, has affiliations to the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and Bohemian Grove, which in itself should raise eyebrows because stories about what they do there, whew, bam. Conspiracies aside, the United Nations is where political leaders from all nations come together. But when you ask Suri, hey Suri, what's the purpose of the United Nations? She will tell you, for promotion of peace, global development, and international cooperation. Underline that last part. Thanks, Suri. Sounds similar to a one world order and not your free hugs and flowers type of peace movement, doesn't it? Yeah. Let's rewind a little bit. We're going to go back to the 60s because by his vice presidency in the 80s, Bushy Bush Sr. was already known for being a little bit more than shady. When the world-famous John F. Kennedy was head of state through 1961 through 63, and you all probably know his name because of his extremely awful, very public, untimely demise. Perhaps one of the most infamous assassinations in history next to Lincoln's. But here's a brief history lesson. It's a well-known fact that the Bushes strongly opposed Kennedy. The the Bushes adored Richard Nixon. Well, it was more so who is the most influenceable in the Republican Party because it pushes arms in capitalism. But before JFK even became president, there was already a dangerous rivalry brewing. Because the president before JFK was Dwight D. Eisenhower from 1953 through 61, whom the Bushes also adored, advised, and convinced to run for office. And see how great they turned out? Yay. Well, guess who Eisenhower's vice president was? Yeah, Richard M. Nixon. And the Bushes loved this not only because of Eisenhower and Nixon themselves, but because they were the first Republican administration in office in over 20 years. Yeah, the last Republican president was Herbert Hoover. And don't get him confused with your Meemaw's old vacuum. He was the president from 1929 through 33, and he had either like really super unlucky timing with the Great Depression and all, or he was just a really bad president. Because honestly, before this, the only thing I remembered about Hoover was all the homeless villages that were popping up during the Depression over like the market crash that people would call Hoovervilles. These tent villages, Hoovervilles. But yeah, that guy was the last Republican. Then we did 3 terms of FDR. Only president in history to ever do that. Legit, we made term laws because of the guy. Then we had 2 terms of President William Howard Taft. And side note, isn't it funny what you remember from grade school? I remember learning about the presidents and our teacher being like, create mnemonic devices to help you remember the names of all these presidents. Which, guys, I have to say, it was the dumbest thing to learn because it still hasn't served me yet. Math was better. But one of the only things I remember about Taft was that he was so portly, he had to have an enlarged bathtub installed in the White House to fit. And I guess it's still there to this day, which makes me think, gosh, living in the White House must be like living in a museum. Not fun at all, because I like to touch stuff. Anyway, then we had Harry S. Truman, 1945 through 53, who's also a Democrat. And finally, I know y'all are holding your breath, Eisenhower. He takes over for 2 terms. And nearing the end of his second term, this is when Nixon and the Bushes and all their backers start licking their chops again. Because the Nixon Republican Party geared up for what they thought would be an easy election year. I bet Dick was already clearing the Oval Office desk off for himself. I bet. But to everyone's surprise, a young and handsome senator from Massachusetts came waltzing onto the scene, sweeping the nation. Fun fact, this was the first presidential campaign ever televised. So a lot of people debate that JFK won solely due to his good looks. But whatever the reason, this became one of the closest presidential campaigns of the 20th century. And the Republican Party was absolutely shooketh when Kennedy beat Nixon in the national popular vote by just 0.2%. 49% to Nixon's 49.5%. While the Electoral College, JFK won 303 votes to Nixon's 219. JFK went on to be the youngest man ever elected into office. So naturally, the control and money-hungry monsters cloaked in the shadows came out for blood. Many assumptions have been made throughout the years. Things like, since JFK was never a Freemason and we just had 20 years a Democrat, not that I believe that has anything to do with control and power nowadays. And I don't know why I always resort to like a mom Minnesotan accent.
I'm a police officer from Up Brainerd investigating some malfeasance. Geez, that's a good lead.
Yeah.
But roll with it. But like maybe the elite families did not like not having the power, you know? They needed to take it back after Eisenhower. Put a new pretty puppet in power that could be manipulated, you know? More than just, they didn't like Kennedy's politics. Get what I'm saying? You get what I'm saying. who's to say, all these other elites like Pappy Prescott, the alleged Nazi sympathizer, and his son H.W. Bush didn't want to try and slide another fascist dictator like their past mistress Hitler into the Oval Office. We don't know for sure. We don't know. But what we do know is with Nixon's loss, the Bushes started making some big moves. November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy is seated next to his wife, Jackie Kennedy, in a blue 1961 Continental convertible. Along with Texas Governor John Connally and his wife, Nellie, the president agreed to be in a motorcade, or parade if you will, during a campaign visit. The crowd that gathered to try and even catch a glimpse of Kennedy grew into the hundreds. By 12:29, the convertible slowly neared the Texas School Book Depository. The four made small talk in the car. "You certainly can't say that the people of Dallas haven't given you a nice welcome," Nellie, the governor's wife, remarked to John.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
America's 35th president's last audible words were, "No, you certainly cannot." Chilling. Now, unsurprisingly, JFK's horrific death, which was quite literally plastered all over our screens, no pun intended, swayed the world. People were watching TVs through shop windows just for an update, for God's sake, Considering the patriarchal fight our country was in at the time, like the ongoing race with the Soviet Union and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a huge part of JFK's presidency, you could understand the people's demand for some answers. Plus, the people loved John Kennedy. There's no denying that. But even with the public's uprising tension, it was still unsettling to many how quickly the government and the CIA were willing to share, air quotes, classified information. In real time, JFK was officially declared dead at 1 p.m. Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged shooter, is apprehended outside a Dallas theater after fatally shooting an on-duty patrolman, literally just 51 minutes after JFK was shot. Right? That was quick. Outside of being in the area and the fact that Oswald undeniably murdered this poor cop, there was nothing else really tying Oswald to Kennedy. Regardless, Oswald underwent hours of intense interrogation, but still denied any involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy, claiming innocence at least for Kennedy's murder until his own death. But that didn't seem to bother officials. He was the perfect lowlife, in and out of institutions, ex-military guy they could possibly pin it on. Because by 2:38 p.m., just over an hour and a half after JFK died, Vice President LBJ was being sworn into office on Air Force One, while Lee Harvey Oswald was getting slammed with charges, first with the murder of Officer Tippit and later charged with President Kennedy's murder. Then, just 2 days after the death of JFK, his supposed murderer, Oswald, was also fatally shot in the abdomen during a jail transfer, silencing Oswald forever. Now, you can see why this is one of the most romanticized conspiracies, like almost ever. Because, hi. There are a lot of loose ends here. And the timing's weird to me. It feels like they're trying to hurry and brush something under the rug when we know our government can drag things out as long as they want. I mean, our government hid the truth about aliens since the basically dawn of our civilization, but they sure fished out and dished out this air quotes assassin rather quickly, don't you think? It seems odd at the very least, but things just got weirder when H.W. Bush came back into the picture. George H.W. went on this entirely unwarranted campaign trying to disprove whether he had any CIA affiliations before he took over as head of the CIA in 1976. And if you Google this, that's exactly what public records show, that he only worked for the CIA from 76 to 77. And all this seems random in itself because, like, I'm sorry, but who cares when you started your career in the CIA? No one. Get over yourself, dude. Nobody was asking. But now we are. Hi. What's the big deal, Bushy? Why'd you bring it up? Because the concern wasn't about the people knowing he was ever in the CIA. In fact, he was quite boastful when he became the head of it. Bush's concern was that the people would learn the truth to when he really started. What year? Because some speculate he got hired on with the CIA as early as 1961. Same year Nixon lost to Kennedy. Now, a lot of the JFK assassination conspiracies are based around this idea that it was an inside job, that the Central Intelligence Agency murdered the president, which I honestly could get on board with. But this narrative was taken up a notch when a memorandum from a U.S. document declassified in 1988 came to light, confirming that H.W. Bush was in fact working for the CIA well before the Cuban Missile Crisis began in 1962, starting his intel career well before the late 70s, like public records indicate. Oh, this memo was written about a meeting that took place between FBI and CIA officials just one day after JFK's murder. Apparently, they were discussing the reaction heard from around the world about Kennedy's death and how they plan to navigate the ongoing crisis with Cuban leader Fidel Castro and all that fun stuff. But that's not what's jarring. At the bottom of this document, it says that the meeting was orally presented by CIA official George H.W. Bush. I'm sorry, but what does red-handed mean again? I'm pretty sure that's proof in poo pudding that he was an agent throughout JFK's direction and not just in 1976 through 77. And I mean, if that's true, which it seems to be, that's a 13-year gap to answer for. What were you up to, Agent HW? And why'd you speak up and even involve yourself in the first place? When questioned years down the line about why he was lying about his CIA working timeline, he responded, quote, must be another George Bush. It wasn't me. Like, come on. He couldn't be a little more creative. Kind of reminds me of my 7-year-old pointing the finger at the dog while clearly being guilty. Wasn't me. So dumb. Then another declassified file comes out, placing George Bush Sr. very close to Dallas just 2 hours after JFK was shot and killed. Now that's salacious. At minimum, many suspect Bush Sr. was at the shooting, if not carrying out the facade himself behind the force of the CIA. But after this old/new information was disclosed to the public, Sr. swore up until his deathbed that he didn't remember where he even was November 22nd, 1963, the day of the assassination. Which, I'm sorry, we're not all as dumb as him. That seems like a bunch of hoop nanny in itself. It does. Obviously, I wasn't around for such events like the Pearl Harbor attack or the JFK assassination, but it's one of those events that kind of marks history where time sort of stands still, right? I've experienced that with 9/11. JFK's assassination definitely seems like one of those world events you would absolutely remember what time and place you were in, no matter what. You feel me? I feel me. So to me, this just kind of implicates Senior further, showing that he's overcompensating. He's trying to distance himself from the truth as much as possible, like we've seen with all the other quacks we've talked about. And many hoped that the JFK files would have been completely declassified and released to the public by now, especially after HW's death in 2018. But so much has been redacted and so much is still hidden to this day. The U.S. government has kept parts of the full story under heavy-duty lock and key. So many speculate that the JFK files will remain classified, or at least partially, until Bush Jr. dies or something. Wow, similar to Prescott's scenario with the Nazis. Others fear that we may never know the whole truth because maybe George Herbert Walker Bush's name is written all over those files, and the U.S. government can't incriminate Sr. without incriminating themselves. And I lean towards that being the truth, because it's better to keep it privatized for the benefit of all involved, including our own government. But what a thought. Could George Herbert have been a shot caller in John F. Kennedy's demise? It's possible. Let me know your thoughts on that at hardtalkswithbnh@gmail.com. There are many other stories of how Bush Sr. spent his time in the CIA. The biggest being how he oversaw CIA drug and gun running operations and how he allegedly directed the shipment of massive amounts of illegal cocaine and weapons and helped infuse it into U.S. society using via the Mena, Arkansas airstrip, which, guys, it shouldn't be shocking because as much money as our country makes off weapons, you don't think we safeguard the market on illegal drugs as well? Many discount our country's interests in illegal drugs, and this is worth detouring over because I don't feel like I've emphasized enough the ownership and complete control that this cartel has over Big Pharma. But not only that, over all the illicit shit as well. Considering most drugs come from petroleum byproducts, hello Rockefeller, and all these elites own their own slices of this big drug, sex, weapon pie, it's important for me to put a spotlight on the role our government plays in the illicit underworld of sex, money, guns, and drugs. That said, in your opinion, who would you say runs the largest drug and gun running operation? Maybe the mafia? Or maybe the Mexican cartel? Okay, sure. Let's run with that. Media has an overabundance of story coverage on drug busts, beatings, kidnappings, ransoms, even murders. I mean, they're absolutely an entity to be feared. But you never really hear about who they're taking out unless it's an American hostage, or really who their competition even is, who they're fighting against, aside from us. And that begs a question. Who would you say are these heavy-hitting gangs' biggest competition? Each other? Because that's funny. I've never heard of a headline about the Mexican cartel and the mafia going toe-to-toe. I mean, it is very plausible. Sounds like a great movie I wish I could bring Pacino back for, but not even Hollywood could truly mimic the horrors of our history and current reality. What I do read a lot about is our government's campaign on this war for drugs. We all know it. It's nothing new. Hey, Dare Officer Penrod, you were great. We grew up hearing about this fight against organized crime. We hear about these big drug busts and how the DEA confiscates millions of dollars worth of illegal substances and weaponry. Are we really so naive to think that all cops are good guys and they just lock all this essentially just money up in evidence forever to collect dust? No! Go watch LA Confidential. It's a classic movie, and it's a great example of what I'm talking about right now. But here's a headline you'll never hear. Our economy debatably relies on the backing of war. You guys are so smart. After all these episodes, you know this by now. But Did you ever think it might also be heroin? It may surprise you to hear that Afghanistan has had a long ass history of opium poppy cultivation. In fact, as of 2021, Afghanistan's harvest produced more than 90% of the illicit heroin globally and more than 95% of the European supply. Now get this, more land is used for opium in Afghanistan than is used for cocoa cultivation in all of Latin America. Like, big pause. What the f***? Now, remember all of this for when we start talking about W. But when I learned how rich the soil was for growing opium poppies over in the Middle East, I had this mega aha moment where I was like, holy shit. No wonder we're so steadfast to jump over there to fight or defend. Yeah, I'm hinting that it ain't about moral concern. And it's definitely not because it's near the Holy Land, okay? What if our need in terms of control over in the Middle East is not for the obvious thing like oil, black gold, but what if really we're quick to help because of our heroin affairs? Some ex-vets have come forward verifying just this, stating that armed U.S. soldiers are essentially out in BFE, heavily guarding these fields. It would be silly to suggest that the United States government isn't a pioneer in the drug and arms trade. The very people that we vote for that are supposed to be safeguarding our freedoms and safety are the kingpins doling out the drugs. You still don't believe me? Well, here's something to chew on. And this is another great example of why the CIA needs to be disbanded as a whole. Okay. Our government has already confessed to doing exactly this. Introducing our society to drugs. And yes, this includes HW. Have y'all ever heard of the MK Ultra experiments that were conducted by the CIA? If not, I'll give you a brief history lesson. MK Ultra didn't become public until 1975. Files became entirely available to the public in July 2001, and it only became public because of a congressional hearing that was finally held investigating the widespread illegal CIA activities happening within the US and around the world. Okay? But after the discovery of lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, by Swiss scientist Albert Hofmann in 1933, Europe quickly saw the therapeutic benefits of this medicine and began research studies on patients suffering with PTSD, depression, addiction, anxiety, etc. Studies we're just starting to see now in 2024. Now, imagine how far humans and society might be if LSD remained in Swiss control and we got to learn the positive attributes to said psychedelics within the 91 years it was demonized. Could you imagine? Maybe our society would be type 1. But hey, the CIA had vastly different ideas and some grim intentions. They believed that they could harness the drug's mind-altering properties for brainwashing or psychological torture, mind control, right? Like, what if we could re-engineer LSD to become a mind control weapon during the Cold War? Blah. They put this plan into action in 1949 when the CIA paid over $250,000 to gain control over all production and all the importation of this new synthetic drug. Then the CIA began distributing acid unknowingly to its own agents to sort of see what would happen. And if you've ever dabbled in the fresh dews of any psychedelics, you can understand why these dose people thought they were absolutely losing their damn minds, because never having tripped before and probably not even knowing this kind of experience was possible, The experiments turned south almost immediately when a CIA agent frantically jumped out of a window, ending his own life. In which then the CIA covered up his death, stating it was a suicide. And then they were actually sued by the agent's family because nobody bought this story that they were serving up. And it was a whole thing. And you'd think, well, with one dead of your own, that might ruffle some feathers. But no. They just figured it must have been the setting. So the CIA began distributing and selling LSD to teens at universities and high schools around the country to also, air quotes, see what would happen. But as we know, this quickly spiraled into the free thinking movement. Thank you. Thank God. Thanks for introducing us to these transcending trips, man. Thanks for lifting the heavy veil of your bullshit. But for the puppets and their masters in power, this was a huge threat. Again, hence why I think Nixon made it so taboo and illegal and really ruined it for everyone for so long. But that wasn't even the end of it. Even with the illegalization of LSD and psychedelics and cannabis, the CIA quietly continued these MK Ultra experiments, but with, air quotes, even better controlled environments, i.e., this is awful, they would dose prison inmates and psych ward patients intravenously with LSD, the most potent form, okay? Taking controlled environments to a whole new freaking level. Essentially melting these people's brains and pushing them to insanity if they weren't there already. Because it wasn't like no drip drip or one tab, no. They'd inject them with like 30 times the amount necessary and leave them locked up in solitary for weeks. I'd go insane too. And these experiments went on from 1953 to about 1973. Some say longer, but even so, that's 20 years, way too long. So, back to my point. The US government is 1 trillion% responsible for infusing illicit drugs into our society. They admitted to doing so, in this case, with LSD. So, try not to roll your eyes at me too hard and be like, Alicia's bonkers, because we know that our government is peddling their own agenda. Big pharma. They push your opiates and over-the-counter drugs while raking in millions. Why is it so baffling? Why do people chalk me up as being a conspiracist? Because I absolutely believe that the United States government, these families who own and control virtually everything, that they are also the ones monopolizing the drug trade, pushing the heavy stuff like cocaine, meth, heroin, fentanyl. It's not a conspiracy if it's true. And I believe in this case with MK Ultra files, officials have allowed them to become so public over the years in efforts to cover up the elite's really shady drug deals that are taking place. But I'm spiraling. Y'all get the backwards picture here. Bush Sr. was in the CIA for all of this, allegedly. And he was said to be a part of this study, especially when Alan Dulles, you guys remember that name from the Rockefellers episode? Yeah. The creator of the CIA, when he signed off on it, okay? Even worse, Kathy O'Brien, a reputable survivor of MK Ultra, said both her and her daughter were repeatedly drugged, tortured, and raped while in captivity, naming Bush Sr. and other high-end politicians as their perpetrators. This has obviously never been confirmed or denied, but there were many allegations over Senior's lifetime about him inappropriately touching minors and groping women. So I don't deny Kathy O'Brien's truth whatsoever. Fast forwarding to 1979. By this time, Bushy Sr. had built quite the career for himself through his fancy connections, remember? And Bushy Sr. or his puppeteers finally decided it was his turn for a run at the presidential chair. Going back to the only campaign Senior ever, air quotes, won by himself, and even that's debatable. In my opinion, he didn't even really win. It was by default because Bush Sr. actually ran against Reagan in that presidential campaign in 1980, pushing a lot of propaganda about his opponent. Like, there's shit talking in politics, but he pushed a lot of propaganda about Reagan. This is when Bush coined the phrase voodoo economics in regard to Reagan's proposal on tax cuts. But when the campaign was nearing its end and Bush was losing against Reagan, and he was terribly, Bush flip-flopped on his own words and joined the ballot as Reagan's vice president just 6 hours before ballot submission closed, dubbing Bushy Sr. to the public as the accidental vice president. It's hilarious. Hilarious. Accident or not, Bush and Reagan served 2 terms together from 1981 to 1989. These were considered the 80s golden years, Republican golden years. Woo. Once actor turned politician, Reagan was well liked for his optimism and his humor. He attempted to recover the economy throughout the 80s and brought a peaceful end to the Cold War, which is BS. But H.W., on the other hand, he couldn't have been more opposite. He was prickly and stuck in his ways, but he'd go on to be Reagan's behind-the-curtains iron fist and was charged with handling many of the unsavory top-secret acts, like in the case with the Iran-Contra affair. But let's zoom in on Senior's vice presidency for a moment, which was, again, 81 through 89, because it started out rocky. On March 30th, 1981, an assassination attempt was made on new President Ronald Reagan, and many suspected that newly elected Vice President Bush Sr. was behind the attempt due to the rumor mill still spitting out the stories about him and JFK's assassination. Now, maybe Bush himself or someone in his pocket helped orchestrate the whole thing to try and get him to be president sooner than he was. But many whispers suggest that the fight back for control stopped when Reagan too was bought out and eventually granted an honorary Scottish Rite Mason certificate issued by the Supreme Councils of the United States. Which is what exactly? AKA Mother Council of the World, or get ready, Supreme Council of the Inspectors General Knights Commander of the House of the Temple of the Solomon of the 33rd degree of ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry of the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States of America. What a mouthful. And if that doesn't spell capital C-U-L-T, then sugar, I don't know what does. Then Senior's connections as former spy master and oil industry maestro really started to pay off.
Because I'm a real spy.
Because his experience made him the go-to man in office for the administration's funneling of money and weapons to, strap in for this, folks, Saddam Hussein. Yeah, y'all know that name. The Butcher of Baghdad himself. As former head of the CIA, George Bush Sr. inherited the CIA's covert history of supporting Saddam Hussein's rise to power over the Iraqi regime. Quote, under Ronald Reagan, one of Bush's chief tasks was to oversee the administration's support for Iraq. It is increasingly clear that George Bush initiated and supported much of the financing, intelligence, and military help that built Saddam's Iraq into an aggressive power that the United States ultimately had to destroy. End quote. This was said by ABC News' Ted Koppel in 1992. Basically saying that we were creating a war for ourselves to benefit from. And as we know, this wouldn't be the first one. Bush and other Reagan administration officials facilitated transfers of intelligence, military supplies, and even the components for advanced chemical and biological weapons. At this same time, Bush is also benefiting from Iraq's arch nemesis, Iran. This is known as the Iran-Contra affair, or Iran Gate. In the early 80s, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, which finally restricted the activities of the CIA and the Department of Defense, the DoD. The amendment was specifically aimed at Nicaragua, which seems random, but this is where an anti-communist called the Contras were battling the communist Sandinista government. Reagan described the Contras as being, quote, the moral equivalent of the founding fathers, end quote. But much of their funding to that point had come via Nicaragua's cocaine trade. Hence Congress's decision to pass the Boland Amendment, because they were like, nah, that's not a good look. It's not a good look. Still, our government instructed National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane to find a way to assist the drug-dealing Contras, regardless of the cost, political or otherwise. Okay? And this wasn't to help oppress Nicaraguans. Oh, no. It was intended to incite more oppression, make more money. Because under Reagan's presidency, HW thrived. He helped invade many impoverished third world countries to set up military bases and to establish American incorporations to essentially steal the different regions' finite resources. And if that's not evil, I'm not sure what else is. Bushy's actions show how little bleeps he had to give about flip-flopping sides and arming both sides, if not all sides, of any war, as long as it meant profit. These two countries have always had some extremely deep-rooted beef, but in the early 80s, Iraq and Iran were engaged in an especially bloody conflict. Iranian-backed terrorists and Hezbollah were holding 7 Americans hostage in Lebanon. So naturally, another ultimatum was delivered from our administration. Find a way to bring those hostages home. In 1985, Reagan's administration brought up the fact that Iran had approached the United States about purchasing weapons for its war against Saddam's neighboring Iraq. There was, however, a U.S. trade embargo, meaning no, you're not allowed to do business with these MFers, okay, with Iran at the time, dating back to the country's revolution, during which 52 American hostages were held for over 444 days in a diplomatic standoff known as the Iran hostage crisis. Now, Bush argued that an arms deal with Iran would not only secure the release of the hostages, but would also help the United States improve relations with Lebanon, providing the country with an ally in the region where it desperately needed one. As a bonus, the arms deal would secure funds the CIA could secretly funnel to the Contra insurgency in Nicaragua. Now, Lebanese newspaper Al Shira first reported the arms deal between the United States and Iran in 1986, well into Reagan's second term. And by that point, 1,500 American missiles had been sold to Iran for $30 million. 3 of the 7 hostages in Lebanon were released, although the terrorist group later took 3 more American hostages, so basically it was all for naught. Meanwhile, Attorney General Edwin Meese launched an investigation into the weapons deal and found that some $18 million of the $30 million Iran had paid for these weapons was now missing. Wonder where that went. It was then that Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North of the National Security Council came forward to acknowledge that he, in fact, diverted the missing funds to the Contras in Nicaragua, who used them to acquire weapons. When Bush Sr. became president in 1989 through 93, this was some of the first matters of business. And people hated him for it almost immediately. Bush Sr. pardoned Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and former President Ronald Reagan. 4 CIA officers and 5 government contractors were prosecuted, although all were found guilty of charges ranging from conspiracy to perjury to fraud. Only one ultimately served time in prison, which I still don't understand. Why don't we prosecute any of these rich old white dudes? Why? But the sickness doesn't end there. It wasn't until Saddam Hussein, butcher of Baghdad, started to get a little too cocky. Okay. This guy they've been selling weapons to for decades now is starting to make a little bit too much noise, especially when his terror began to threaten the flow of Middle East oil, which, hello, we're not going to let happen. We want our money. That's when our administration was like, he's had his 5 minutes. Let's take him out. So Bush Sr. organized the invasion of Kuwait, kicking off the first Gulf War, or the Iran-Iraq War, in 1991, killing as many as 200,000 people during 7-week conflict in what was considered, quote, the most intense aerial bombardment in the history of war. Whoa. At this point, Bush started to urge the Iraqi people to rise up against the regime and take back their power. But when they did rebel, the White House decided they'd benefit more with Saddam's party in power, peeling back all American assistance, military assistance. Like, never mind. Still a lot of money to be made off of that nut job, right? So our government allowed Saddam Hussein's regime to repress because they were nowhere to be found, prolonging his reign of terror until he went into hiding in 2003. All this comes to light after 2 mass graves were discovered June 5th, 2005. In the late winter of 1991, at least 28 men were executed on the edge of the Asham Desert in Iraq, after President H.W. encouraged Iraq Shiites and Kurds to try and take out Mr. Hussein themselves. After these mass graves were uncovered, H.W. came forward stating, "What happened to the Shiites is one of the deepest regrets of my presidency." To me, basically saying that he's guilty for sure and helped the rise of the regime, and basically set all these people up to die when they didn't have to, when we could have helped them. I mean, we were already over there. Like, what? Like, it's wild. We ultimately helped the rise of the regime and ultimately the fall of the regime. And all the killing that ensued because of the turmoil that was stirred up was partly H.W.'s fault. But yet again, a rich man in power is shielded. After the first Gulf War, Sr. had approval ratings of 90%. I mean, what does that say? People like having the idea of having something to fight for, someone in power who's fighting for them. But when there's no war and just a ditzy white guy at the helm of our country, people started to notice, pay a little closer attention. During the 1990s recession, HW's ratings plummeted to 37% because the boy broke under pressure. And to be honest, he just wasn't all that likable. Aside from air quotes patriotism, he offered nothing to the American people, resulting in just one term in office. HW lived out his life on his ranch in Texas, helping his children reach their own heights of success, discrediting any other headlines that would come up not only about him, but his father and his sons in the future. H.W. Bush died November 30th, 2018 at the age of 94 from a rare disease called vascular Parkinson, whereafter George W. Bush, took head of the family dynasty. And that, my trippy hippies, is the bulk of Bushy Bush Sr.'s life story and all his naughty doings, biddings. He wasn't a great guy. I mean, he wasn't the worst. Took following in his father's footsteps to a whole new level and just should have never been given any power in the first place. Am I right? As I said in the beginning, I think he was just a face for the fallout. I don't think this guy was a mastermind behind much of anything. I think he got paid a lot of money to do a lot of things for some naughty people. Okay? But still. And the same goes for W, I think. But still, why the hell did we think his son would do a better job? Next week, we tie it up with W. Thank God. More cocaine, war for oil. Was he finishing what his daddy started? 9/11 conspiracies. It's pack loaded, and totes why I decided to do one more part, because between the assassination of JFK, the MK Ultra, talking about our government being the biggest drug dealers on the market, the CIA, funding Saddam Hussein's rise to power. I figured it'd be a little bit more digestible to try and break it up, especially since 9/11 is still so sensitive and not that far removed from all of our hearts. So next week, all on that, and how the Bushes are supposedly related to basically everyone. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this episode and appreciate what I've been talking about so far, go ahead and smash that like and subscribe button. If you want to link up to share stories, or if you have any questions, you can find the podcast on IG or Instagram, at Hard Talks Podcast, with more links in my bios. These declassified files were taken from the National Archives. Links can be found in my show notes. And as always, I appreciate you little shroomies so much for taking the time out of your very busy days to expand your minds, to begin questioning everything, to start thinking unlimited with me here. I love you all so much, and I'll see you soon. Cheers.